Liverpool, England, February 12, 1993. A bitterly cold Friday in the northwest of England. The city, known for its maritime history, its music, its fierce working class pride, and its legendary football clubs, is going about its business. In the suburb of Brutal, the New Strand shopping centre is busy with mothers pushing prams, pensioners doing their weekly shop, and children tugging at their parents' sleeves for sweets and toys. Among them is a 2-year-old James Patrick Bulger. He's a happy, chubby-cheeked toddler with a mop of brown hair and a beaming smile that could light up any room. He is wearing a blue jacket, a detail that would become seared into the nation's memory. He is holding his mother's hand as she shops at a butcher's counter to pay for some meat. For just a moment, a single fleeting moment, Denise Bulger lets go of her son's hand to reach for her purse. That moment lasts only seconds. When she turns around, James is gone. What follows over the next 2 days would become one of the most infamous crimes in British history. A crime that would shock the world, expose the darkest corners of the human psyche, and force a nation to confront the unthinkable, that evil can wear the face of a child. On that cold February afternoon, two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, were playing through it from school. They had been hanging around the shopping centre, shoplifting and causing trouble. Bored and restless, looking for excitement, they spotted the toddler. On a whim, they took his hand and led him away. Over the next 2.5 miles, through busy streets and past dozens of passerbys, these two boys dragged a crying, frightened toddler to a disused railway track in Walton. They tortured him. They beat him with bricks, stones, and an iron bar. They stamped on him. They threw paint in his eyes. They stripped him from the waist down and left him for dead on the tracks. His body was found 2 days later. He had suffered 42 separate injuries. The murder of James Bulger is a story of unimaginable cruelty, but it is also a story of a nation's shattered innocence. The moment Britain realized that children could be capable of unspeakable evil, it is a story that changed the legal system, sparked a national debate about parenting, violence in media, and the age of criminal responsibility, and left scars that have never fully healed. This is the story of James Bulger, the toddler whose face became the symbol of a nation's grief. James Patrick Bulger was born on March 16, 1990. He was the firstborn son of Denise and Ralph Bulger, a much-wanted, much-loved child who arrived into the world with all the promise and hope that every new life brings. He was a happy, healthy toddler, a bouncing baby boy who loved nothing more than being with his family. His grandparents doted on him. He was a child who was always smiling, always laughing, always curious about the world around him. His mother later described him as a little angel. He had just celebrated his 2nd birthday, a month before his death. James was an active, adventurous child. He loved exploring. He loved the attention of his parents and grandparents. He was at the wonderful age where everything was new and exciting. The bright lights of a shopping centre, the noise of a busy street, the simple joy of holding his mother's hand. On the morning of February 12, 1993, James and his mother went to the New Strand shopping centre in Bootle. It was a routine trip, just a mother and her son doing the weekly shopping. Denise had decided not to take the buggy that day. James was old enough to walk, to hold her hand, to be a big boy. Denise stopped at a butcher's shop to buy some meat. She let go of James's hand for just a moment to get change from her purse. He was standing right beside her, just inches away. He was a curious, active child, and he wandered a few feet away, drawn by the bright lights and noise of the shopping centre. That was all it took. In those few seconds, James was approached by 2 older boys. They took his hand and led him away. His mother turned around. He was gone. Denise Bulger would spend the next 48 hours searching for her son. Living through every parent's worst nightmare, she would appear on television, tears streaming down her face, begging for his safe return. She would later describe the moment she realized he was gone as the worst moment of my life. She had no idea that her son was already being marched to his death. The impact on the Bulger family was devastating. Ralph Bulger, James's father, would later reveal that he never sought grief, counseling after the murder. Instead, he buried himself in work, working 7 days a week just to keep his mind occupied. He would later admit that in his darkest moments he had blamed Denise for letting James out of his sight, a reaction he said he was deeply ashamed of. The grief tore the family apart. Denise and Ralph had another son, Michael, just 10 months after James's death, but they split less than a year later. The weight of their grief for 7 meant that they could not console each other. Denise would later remarry, becoming Denise Fergus, and found some measure of peace with the new husband Stuart, whom she said keeps me together. She told him when they first met that he had an opportunity to walk away from the burden of her grief. He didn't. Together they set up the James Bulger Memorial Trust to support young people who are disadvantaged due to bereavement or who have been victims of crime. Together they set up the James Bulger Memorial Trust to support young people who are disadvantaged due to bereavement or who have been victims of crime. But Denise has never stopped grieving. Decades later, she still sets a place with James at the Christmas table. She has said, "I always say the day I stop speaking about James is the day I'm going to join him." The 2 boys who took James Bulger were not hardened criminals in any conventional sense. They were children, 10 years old, just like any other primary school pupils, but their backgrounds, their home lives, and their behaviors would reveal a more troubling picture. Robert Thompson was born on August 23, 1982. He was the 5th of 6 children. His family was chaotic and deeply dysfunctional. His father was a violent man who subjected Thompson's mother and siblings to severe physical and sexual abuse. Robert himself was beaten and molested by his father. When Robert was 6 years old, his father left suddenly with another woman. His mother, Anne, herself a victim of childhood violence, was left to raise 7 sons on her own. She turned to alcohol. The violence in the household did not stop when the father left. The brothers turned on each other, with fights so severe that they threatened each other with knives. 2 of Robert's older brothers were put into care, and 1 attempted suicide. By any measure, the Thompson household was a family in crisis. John Venables, however, was born on August 13, 1982. His background was different in some ways, equally troubled in others. His parents had divorced. There was no evidence of physical or sexual abuse in the Venables household. The family was more financially comfortable than the Thompsons, but John's mother, Susan, suffered from psychiatric problems and frequently complained of feeling overwhelmed with parenting. John took his parents' separation poorly. He had 2 siblings with learning disabilities, and he felt he received little attention compared to them. He was bullied at school as the brother of thieves. In response, he began to display very disturbed behavior, cutting himself in his clothes, tearing work from the walls, and trying to choke another boy with a ruler. When John tried to choke that boy, the school system's response was simply to transfer him to another school, St. Mary's in Walton. It was at St. Mary's that John Venables met Robert Thompson. Both were outsiders. Both had been held back a year from underachievement. Both were bored, restless, and angry at the world. They became friends, 2 troubled boys who found each other a shared sense of alienation and a willingness to act out. In their final term together, Robert and John played truant for more than a third of the time. They were running wild, stealing from shops, and calling any adults who intervened slags or twats. Robert would sometimes stay out all night in a secret den by the railway line. The same railway line, just weeks later, they would commit their terrible crime. The question that would haunt the nation was simply, why? Why would 2 10-year-old boys take a toddler and torture him to death? What could possibly have driven them to such an act? The answers were never fully clear. Some experts pointed to their troubled backgrounds, the violence, the neglect, the instability. Some pointed to the violent films they had been watching, films like Child's Play 3, which they had reportedly seen on video, and which the trial judge would later cite as a possible influence. Some suggested that they had simply acted on a whim, that they had taken James, panicked, and then killed him to cover their tracks. But none of these explanations fully satisfied the public. The murder of James Bulger was a crime that defied comprehension. It challenged the very notion of childhood innocence. It forced the nation to ask whether some children could be born evil, or whether they were made that way by the failures of the adults around them. The trial judge, Mr. Justice Morland, would later lay the responsibility very firmly at the feet of the parents. He called for a public debate about the ramifications of the crime, saying, "The home background, upbringing, family was central to understanding what had happened." On the afternoon of February 12, 1993, James Bulger was led out of the New Strand shopping centre by Robert Thompson and John Venables. The CCTV footage captured the moment, two boys holding the hand of a tiny toddler, walking out of the shopping centre together. The time was 3:39 p.m. The image was grainy, indistinct, but it would become one of the most haunting and iconic images in British history. James's mother, Denise, was still inside the shopping centre, frantically searching for her son. She had no idea he was already being led away, through the doors, out into the cold February air. For the next 2.5 miles, the boys dragged James through the streets of Bootle and Walton. It was a journey that would have taken hours for a toddler of his size. James was crying. He had a head injury, the result of being dropped on his head earlier in the walk. The boys were seen by 38 people during their journey. 38 people saw two older boys with a distressed, crying toddler. Some challenged them. They asked why the toddler was crying, why he was distressed. Thompson and Venables made excuses. They said James was their little brother, or that he was lost, or that they were taking him to a police station. One encounter in particular is heartbreaking to recount. Outside a flower shop, a woman confronted the boys and asked if James was alright. At one point, her own little girl held James's hand, but Venables told her it was alright. They were taking him to the police station. The woman failed to intervene. Not one of those 38 people intervened to stop the boys. Not one of them called the police. The boys passed a police station. They could have handed James over, but they didn't. In the years since, some of those witnesses have spoken of their guilt and regret. One woman who saw them later realized what she had seen and has lived with the burden of guilt ever since. But as one journalist observed, no one in their wildest imaginations could have ever thought that two 10-year-olds were planning anything as terrible as they were. Denise Bulger does not blame the witnesses. She has always maintained that she blames only two people for what happened to her son. The walk ended as a disused railway track in Walton, just a few hundred yards from the police station. It was a desolate, overgrown area, hidden from view, a place where Robert Thompson had sometimes stayed out all night in a secret den. There the boys began to torture James. They threw bricks and stones at him. They kicked him, they stomped on him. They beat him with an iron bar, specifically a fish plate, a heavy piece of railway track metal. They stripped him down from the waist. They threw paint in his eyes. James Bulger suffered 42 separate injuries. The pathologist who examined his body later said that there were so many injuries that not one could be identified as the fatal blow. Jurors at the trial were passed blood-stained bricks, stones, and a metal bar, and they heard testimony that James had been battered to death by more than 30 blows to the head and the body. When they were finished, the boys placed James's body on the railway track and covered it with rubble. They left him there. His body was cut in two by a passing train, but the post-mortem confirmed that James was already dead before the train arrived. The boys walked away. They went back to their normal lives. They went home. They went to bed. For 2 days, the nation searched for James Bulger. His mother appeared on television, begging for his return. His father made desperate pleas. Police searched the shopping centre, the streets, the canals. They found nothing. Then on February 14, 1993, Valentine's Day, children playing near the railway track discovered James's body. The nation was shocked, but the worst was yet to come. The investigation into James Bulger's murder was one of the most intense in British history. It was led by Detective Superintendent Albert Kirby, who commanded a force of up to 200 police officers. The initial focus was on adults. The police assumed that a toddler could only have been taken by an adult. They searched for a man, a woman, a stranger. They had no idea that they were looking for children. The breakthrough came when police released the CCTV footage from the shopping centre. The grainy image of two boys leading a toddler away by the hand was broadcast across the nation. It was a shocking image, but it also gave the police their first real lead. A shopkeeper who had seen the two boys playing truant on the day of the abduction came forward. She gave the police the names Robert Thompson and John Venables. On February 18, 1993, just 6 days after the abduction, both boys were arrested and charged with the abduction and murder of James Bulger. They were the youngest people to be charged with murder in Britain in the 20th century. When John Venables was interviewed by police, he confessed. He said simply, "We did it. Will you tell his mum I'm sorry?" The police interviews with the boys were recorded. Those audio tapes, which would later be played in court and in documentaries, are deeply unsettling. The voice of the boys sound young, vulnerable, almost childlike. It is a jarring contrast with the brutality of the crime they had committed. The boys were too small to reach the docking hole. The base of the dock had to be raised 18 inches so that they could see over it. The nation was in shock. Children, 10-year-old children, had committed one of the most brutal murders in British history. The arrest of the boys raised profound questions about the age of criminal responsibility. In England and Wales, the age of criminal responsibility is 10, one of the lowest in Europe. The Bulger case would feed into a political and media climate that viewed young offenders as wicked, irresponsible, immoral and evil. Decades later, the case would still cast a long shadow over any discussion of raising the age of criminal responsibility. As one commentator observed, government will not contemplate raising the age of criminal responsibility in England and Wales while the shadow of James Bulger looms large over any such discussion. The trial of Robert Thompson and John Venables began on November 1, 1993, at Preston Crown Court. It lasted 17 days. 13 of those days were dedicated to examining the movements of Thompson and Venables as they walked James from the shopping centre to the scene of his death. The boys, now 11 years old, were tried as adults because they were over the age of criminal responsibility. 10 years old in England and Wales, the proceedings were held in an adult court, but the public was not allowed to see the boys. They were known only as Child A. Thompson and Child B. Venables. The prosecution presented a devastating case. They had the CCTV footage, they had the eyewitnesses' testimony of the 38 people who had seen the boys with James. They had the forensic evidence, the blood-stained bricks, stones and the iron bar. They had Venables' confession. The defense offered no evidence. The argument was that the boys were too young to understand what they had done, that they had not intended to kill James, and that his death was an accident. The trial was deeply emotional. James's parents, Denise and Ralph, were in the public gallery of the bar. Denise was heavily pregnant with her second son, Michael. On November 24, 1993, the jury returned its verdict. It had deliberated for 5.5 hours. Both boys were found guilty of abduction and murder. As the foreman said, guilty to the count of murder, Susan Venables, John's mother, cried, and his father buried his head in his hands. John looked at the jury wide-eyed, while Robert Thompson sat impassively. His mother, Anne, was not in court. Denise Bulger in the public gallery was kissed by Detective Superintendent Albert Kirby. 8 members of the Bulger family were present. One shouted as the boys left the dock, "How do you feel now, you little bastards?" The trial judge, Mr. Justice Morland, sentenced them to be detained during Her Majesty's pleasure. a mandatory sentence for young offenders convicted of murder. He described abduction and murder as a cunning and wicked act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. The judge also made a decision that would prove highly controversial. He lifted the anonymity order that had protected the boys' identities. The names and photographs were released to the public. They became the most hated children in Britain. The judge also made a strong statement attacking the influence of violent films on children. "It is not for me to pass judgment on their upbringing," he said, "but I suspect exposure to violent video films may in part be an explanation." Detectives who interviewed the boys were more blunt. One said, "These two were freaks who just found each other. You should not compare these two boys with other boys. They were evil." The sentences of Robert Thompson and John Venables were subjected to intense political and legal controversy. The trial judge set a minimum tariff of 8 years. The Lord Chief Justice increased this to 10 years. Then, in response to a petition signed by 278,000 people, Home Secretary Michael Howard increased the tariff to 15 years. In 1997, the Law Lords ruled that Howard had acted illegally in raising the tariff. In 1999, the European Court of Human Rights found that the boys had been denied a fair trial. In June 2001, after serving just 8 years, Thompson and Venables were released on life license. They were given new identities and protected by a court order guaranteeing them lifetime anonymity. The decision to release them was deeply controversial. The public was outraged. Denise Bulger has spent decades fighting to keep Venables behind bars. She has attended parole hearings. She has campaigned for justice. She has never stopped grieving for her son. Since their release, the two boys, now men, have followed very different paths. Robert Thompson has not re-offended since his release in 2001. He lives in an undisclosed location under an assumed name. He has kept a low profile and has stayed out of trouble. John Venables, however, has re-offended repeatedly. In 2010, he was recalled to prison after indecent images of children were found on his computer. In 2018, he was jailed for 3 years and 4 months for possessing more than 1,000 indecent images of children. He remains in prison today, having had his parole applications repeatedly denied. Ralph Bulger, James's father, has called for Venables' new identity to be revealed for the safety of the public. He has described giving Venables lifelong anonymity as a failed experiment. On the 25th anniversary of his son's death, he said, "You wouldn't want the person living next door to you, would you?" But the courts have repeatedly upheld the anonymity order. In 2019, a judge ruled that Venables must keep his anonymity to protect him from serious violence. In March 2024, MPs urged the government to hold a public inquiry into the murder. More than 213,000 people had signed a petition calling for the facts of the case to be laid out. The government was urged to lay out all the facts of the case of murdered toddler James Bulger in a public inquiry to show there was nothing to hide. The case continues to haunt the nation up until this day. The murder of James Bulger is one of the most shocking crimes in British history. It is a story of unimaginable cruelty. A 2-year-old boy tortured to death by two 10-year-olds who should have been in school, who should have been playing football or watching cartoons, who should have been children. But the legacy of the James Bulger case is not just about the crime, it is about the questions that remain unanswered. How could children commit such an act? What drives a child to kill? How do we protect our children from each other? And how do we balance justice for victims with the possibility of rehabilitation for young offenders? The case also changed Britain. It led to a national debate about the role of violent media, the failures of the welfare system, and the age of criminal responsibility. It led to a survey in which 97% of parents cited the possible abduction of their children as their greatest fear. The case was hailed as the ultimate expression of a pervasive and deepening wave of moral degeneracy and child lawlessness. 20 years after the tragic death, England and Wales was recognised as one of the most punitive youth justice jurisdictions in Europe. But the case also raised difficult questions about whether children can ever truly be held accountable in the same ways as adults. Repeated calls to raise the age at which children can be prosecuted have never been taken seriously, at least partly because of the James Bulger case. As one former Supreme Court Justice put it, it is high time to banish the long shadow of the James Bulger case. But most of all, the James Bulger case is about a little boy who never got to grow up. James Bulger was just 2 years old. He was a happy, smiling toddler who loved his family and loved life. He had a future that was stolen from him, stolen by 2 children whom, for whatever reason, chose to do the unthinkable. His mother Denise has said, "I will never stop fighting for justice for my son. I will never stop loving him. He was my little angel." James's father, Ralph, has spoken of the unending agony caused by the loss of his adored little boy. He said that thinking about the murder was like a knife sticking in my back. He still visits his son's grave. The face of James Bulger, captured on CCTV, held by the hand of his killers, is a face that will never be forgotten. He was 2 years old, he was innocent, and he deserved so much better. The murder of James Bulger is a reminder of the fragility of innocence, the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places, and the enduring power of a mother's love and a father's grief. It is a story that will continue to haunt Britain for generations to come.